Good afternoon. A violent maritime confrontation in the Florida Straits has left 4 people dead and 6 others injured, raising immediate questions about sovereignty, migration, and escalating regional tensions. This is Kenya News Update today, and I'm your host. We're taking a deep dive into a story that connects Havana, Washington, and the dangerous waters in between. At approximately 9:15 a.m. local time on Wednesday, February 25th, 2026, Cuban Coast Guard vessels engaged a Florida-registered speedboat in what authorities in Havana are calling a territorial defense operation. The incident occurred approximately 8 nautical miles north of the Cuban coast, just outside the country's 12 nautical mile territorial waters, but within its 24 nautical mile contiguous zone. The Cuban government states its patrol boats issued multiple warnings to the vessel, which was traveling at high speed and failed to heed commands to stop. According to their official statement, the vessel attempted to ram a Coast Guard craft, prompting the use of lethal force. 4 individuals aboard the speedboat were killed instantly, while 6 others sustained injuries ranging from moderate to critical. The nationalities of the deceased and wounded remain unknown, and the vessel, described as a high-performance 45-foot center console boat with triple 300-horsepower outboard engines, is now impounded in the port of Havana. This incident comes at a time of heightened geopolitical friction. Since President Donald Trump's return to the White House in January 2025, U.S.-Cuba relations have reverted to a state of maximum pressure, with the reinstatement of stringent economic sanctions and travel restrictions that had been eased during the previous administration. The current U.S. Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, a longtime hardliner on Cuba policy, has consistently advocated for a more confrontational approach toward the communist government. In this context, a shootout involving a Florida-registered vessel takes on profound significance. We must examine this event through multiple lenses, as a potential migrant interdiction, a law enforcement action, a national security incident, and a political flashpoint. Let's begin with the facts on the water. The Florida Straits, a 90-mile-wide channel separating Cuba from the United States, has been a maritime highway for decades, used for both legal trade and illicit activities. According to U.S. Coast Guard data from fiscal year 2025, there were over 5,200 documented attempts by Cuban nationals to reach U.S. shores by sea, a 35% increase from the previous year. Simultaneously, interdictions of vessels suspected of smuggling drugs, weapons, or people have risen by approximately 22% in the same period. The Cuban border guard, known as the Tropas Guardiafronteras, operates a fleet of approximately 120 fast attack craft, along with larger patrol vessels. Their standard operating procedure, as outlined in their 2024 Maritime Defense Manual, authorizes the use of graduated force, up to and including disabling fire, against vessels that refuse to comply with orders within the country's claimed jurisdictional zones. The manual specifies that verbal warnings must be given via loudspeaker and radio, followed by warning shots across the bow, before any direct fire is authorized. The Cuban government claims this protocol was followed to the letter. However, the absence of independent witnesses and the conflicting accounts that typically emerge in such incidents leave room for doubt. The U.S. response has been measured but pointed. The Department of State, through a spokesperson, acknowledged it is, quote, aware of reports of an incident in Cuban waters, unquote, and is, quote, seeking clarification through diplomatic channels, unquote. The U.S. Coast Guard's 7th District, based in Miami, confirmed it had no assets in the immediate vicinity at the time and was not involved. Notably, there has been no statement from the White House or from Secretary Rubio directly, a silence that analysts interpret as deliberate while an investigation is conducted. The political dimension is inescapable. Florida, with its influential Cuban-American community, has long been a focal point of U.S. policy toward the island. The fact that the vessel was registered in Florida immediately raises questions about its origins, ownership, and mission. Was this a smuggling run? A migrant pickup, a provocation, or simply a recreational boater who strayed too far and panicked? Vessel registration records are public, but obtaining them takes time. Initial checks indicate the boat was purchased at a marina in Fort Lauderdale just 6 months ago for an estimated $450,000. The listed owner is a limited liability corporation, a common practice that can obscure the true beneficial owner. Law enforcement sources suggest such high-speed, high-value boats are frequently used in the narcotics trade, transporting multi-hundred-kilogram loads from go-fast vessels to the mainland. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel, or CJNG, whose leader Nemesio, quote, El Mencho, unquote, Oscar was reportedly killed just days ago in Mexico, has known maritime trafficking routes through the Caribbean. Could this incident be a spillover from the violent power vacuum created by that event? The timing is certainly suggestive. In Mexico, the death of El Mencho has triggered a wave of violence, with 25 Mexican troops killed in subsequent clashes, as announced by Security Minister Ricardo Trevilla Trillo. Cartels often diversify their transit methods when under pressure. A shift from overland routes through Central America to maritime routes via the Caribbean is a well-documented contingency. The CJNG has previously used Cuba as a transshipment point, exploiting corruption and the country's economic desperation. If this speedboat was part of a cartel logistics chain, the Cuban Coast Guard's aggressive response could be interpreted as a message that Havana will not tolerate its waters being used as a criminal corridor, especially under the watchful eye of a hostile U.S. administration. Another compelling theory is that this was a migrant smuggling operation. The economics are stark. With the Cuban economy in a perpetual state of crisis, exacerbated by U.S. sanctions and internal mismanagement, the incentive to leave is powerful. Smugglers, known as, quote, poleros, unquote, in the maritime context, charge exorbitant fees, often between $8,000 and $15,000 per person, for the dangerous crossing. A boat of this size could carry 10 to 15 people, representing a potential payday of over $120,000 for a single trip. The Cuban government has a policy of actively interdicting migrant vessels before they can reach international waters, viewing emigration as both a brain drain and a political embarrassment. A violent interception serves as a brutal deterrent. From Havana's perspective, this action is a straightforward defense of sovereignty. President Miguel Diaz-Canel's government faces constant pressure from Washington and internal dissent. Demonstrating firm control over its maritime borders is a key pillar of its authority. By publicizing the incident and emphasizing the Florida registration, they frame it as a victory against external aggression, potentially rallying nationalist sentiment at home. They can point to the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, which grants coastal states certain rights in their contiguous zone to prevent infringement of customs, fiscal, immigration, or sanitary laws. Cuba is a signatory, the United States is not. This legal framing provides a veneer of international legitimacy to their actions. However, the use of lethal force against an unarmed civilian vessel, even one that was non-compliant, will face severe scrutiny under international human rights law. The principle of proportionality is key. Was ramming a Coast Guard vessel a credible enough threat to justify killing 4 people? Without video evidence from the Cuban patrol boats, which has not been released, we only have one side of the story. The families of the deceased, whoever they are, will demand answers. If they are Cuban nationals, the diaspora community in Miami will erupt in outrage. If they are American citizens, the diplomatic fallout could be severe. Let's consider the regional weather context, which is often an overlooked factor in maritime incidents. The Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico have been experiencing a period of intense and erratic weather. As reported in analyses of Mediterranean storms, and, quote, atmospheric machine gun, unquote, of systems can create treacherous, unpredictable conditions. While the day of the incident was reportedly clear, the preceding week saw a series of fast-moving squalls and high winds in the Florida Straits. Such conditions can lead to poor visibility, high seas, and communication difficulties. A panicked captain in rough weather might have failed to hear or understand radio commands. A Coast Guard crew, themselves battling the elements, might have had their judgment clouded by stress and the perceived aggression of a high-speed approach. This environmental dimension reminds us that these are not sterile geopolitical chess moves. They are human dramas played out on a dangerous, dynamic stage. The strategic implications are wide-ranging. For the U.S. Coast Guard and Southern Command, this incident highlights the challenges of maritime domain awareness in a crowded and contested space. It will likely lead to calls for increased patrols and surveillance, further militarizing these waters. For the government of Kenya and other nations observing from afar, this is a case study in how domestic politics in powerful nations can ignite international crises. Kenya, with its own extensive coastline and challenges with maritime security, understands the complexities of policing territorial waters. The Kenyan Coast Guard Service, established in 2018, has grown to a force of over 1,200 personnel, but still grapples with limited assets. An incident like this underscores the need for clear rules of engagement, robust training, and transparent accountability mechanisms to avoid tragedy and diplomatic incidents. Furthermore, the shadow of the drug trade connects this Caribbean event to global networks of crime that affect Africa. West Africa remains a major transit point for cocaine headed to Europe, and the cartels operating in the Americas have established links there. Violence in Mexico or interdiction in Cuba can have ripple effects that disrupt these networks, sometimes pushing crime into new, more vulnerable regions. The economic angle cannot be ignored. Cuba's desperate need for foreign currency makes it susceptible to becoming a nexus for illicit finance. Remittances from the U.S., which were estimated at over $3.5 billion annually before the latest sanctions, have been severely curtailed. The tourism industry, which once brought in over $3 billion in a good year, is a fraction of that. In this context, the temptation for state actors to turn a blind eye or even facilitate lucrative smuggling operations can be immense. A violent public interdiction could be a genuine enforcement action, or it could be a signal to one cartel that a rival has paid for exclusive passage rights. The murky world of maritime crime is often about signaling and control as much as it is about any single shipment. As we await more information, several key questions remain unanswered. First, the identities of the dead and injured. DNA analysis and forensic examination of the vessel will take time. Second, the full cargo of the boat. Was it empty, or was it carrying drugs, cash, or weapons? Cuban authorities have not disclosed this. Third, the complete radio and radar logs from both the Cuban Coast Guard and any nearby vessels or air traffic control. These records would provide an objective timeline of events. Fourth, the stance of the Trump administration. Will this be treated as a law enforcement issue, a tragic accident, or an act of aggression by a hostile state? The response will set the tone for U.S.-Cuba relations for the foreseeable future. In conclusion, the shootout off the coast of Cuba is far more than a brief news item. It is a microcosm of the enduring conflict between the United States and Cuba, a window into the brutal economics of migration and smuggling, a test case for maritime law under pressure, and a potential trigger for wider regional instability. The 4 lives lost represent a human cost in a decades-old political struggle. The 6 injured face an uncertain future, and the 2 governments involved now navigate the treacherous waters of diplomacy, where one misstep can lead to further escalation. For now, the Florida Straits remain a silent witness, a blue highway where hope, desperation, ideology, and commerce violently collide. The world will be watching to see what floats to the surface next. This has been a Kenya News Update Today Deep Dive. Subscribe to Kenya News Update Today for continued coverage of this developing story and other news from across the region and the world.